Hello, and welcome to a grand tour of the region of Greece called Attica, the stretch of countryside and beautiful coasts of which Athens was the principal city and capital when it was a city-state rather than part of the modern nation of Greece itself. We are going to prepare for our perimeter tour of great sites around the borders and coasts of Attica by going to a very central point as our jumping-off place, the very best preserved classical monument in all of Athens, the Tower of the Winds. In the 1st century BC, a wealthy donor, inevitably, decided to give to the city of Athens a monument to place in the area called the Roman Agora, which was off to the east of the classical Greek Agora, or open space, marketplace, civic center. The Roman Agora, which included a grand library of Hadrian and lots of stoas or porticos, places to sell olives and wheat, also included, near what is today the iron fence, beyond which is the Plaka, the modern market area of Athens, this grand Tower of the Winds. It's an octagonal structure, complete right up to its fantastic roof tiles, built of stone, and serving both as a civic clock tower and as a weather vane. Weather vanes, which showed you which way the wind was blowing, were very important to classical Athenians because they were a people of the sea. And this weather vane has not 4 directions like our modern ones, north, east, south, west, but 8, because the classical Athenians broke down the winds into 8 different named winds in order to represent the prevailing winds that blew at different seasons and that brought different kinds of weather. Go to the Tower of the Winds, they're off at the east end of the Roman Agora. Walk around it, looking up at the panels on which are carved flying gods, each one of which represents a different one of these winds. Start in the north with a god that has given us some words, Boreas. He's given us boreal and aurora borealis. He's the north wind. And he is heavily clad in warm clothing and blowing a conch shell in order to funnel his cold north wind down from Thrace onto the Athenians. Go around to the east side and you will see another god that has given us a word, Zephyros, the west wind. He began to blow in the springtime and brought along the flowers, so he is a lightly clad young man who is pouring flowers out onto the land below him. And finally, around on the southwest, my favorite wind, Lips, L-I-P-S, Lips, this southwest wind, dominated at a time which was good for sailing and seafaring. So he is holding the stern of a ship, the thing called the aphlaston, which is a curved stern piece that would have been near the rudders or the steering oars of every ancient Greek ship. Also, on the outside of the Tower of the Wind, at every angle, you will see those little bronze pieces coming out which make each angle a sundial. The shadow of the sun was projected onto lines carved onto the side of the Tower of the Winds, so that whatever angle you were looking at, the lines were corrected to show the proper hour of the day for that moment. But of course that only covered the daytime. What about night? How are you going to tell the hours in a world which only seemed to have sundials? Well, the Tower of the Winds shows us an ancient invention, an invention that allowed people to calculate hours on cloudy days or at nighttime, a water clock. Back in the Athenian Agora, and visible today in the Museum of the Classical Athenian Agora in the Stoa of Attalus, you will see an early attempt at a water clock that was part of the Athenian democracy system. This consists of 2 pots, one set on a high level, the other on a shelf below it. The upper pot has a little spout. It would be filled with water, and when the stopper in the spout was pulled, in a controlled stream, that water poured into the lower vessel. What was this used to do? It wasn't to calculate hours of the day. It was to calculate the lengths of speeches at trials and perhaps also political speeches in the assembly. We have fascinating records of speeches in which the orator, who's talking to the jury, will say, "I must make myself brief. I see that my water is almost gone." Or where a speaker will say, "I yield some of my water to my distinguished colleague who shall speak next." These are references to those water clocks in those wonderful pots that you can still see today. So the idea of a steady flow of water measuring a distance time is adapted in the Tower of the Winds from the 1st century BC in a very sophisticated way. So let's show you how it worked.
According to one reconstruction, water entered an upper tank from an outside pipe fed by a spring on the Acropolis. An outlet pipe directed water into 3 fountains, the piping for which was hidden within a basin and 2 sculptural features. Below the upper water tank was a second water tank. A second outlet pipe sent water to this tank. As the water level rose, a float rose with it. The rising of the float allowed a counterweight connected by a system of pulleys to fall, turning an axially mounted disc engraved with a celestial map. The motion of the disc through a wire framework indicated the hours of the day.
And so you can see this was one of the most amazing structures to be found anywhere on Earth. We're going to encounter another one of these clocks at our very first destination as we go around all the points of the compass on the perimeter of this wonderful land of Attica. We're going north to the shrine of a prophet deity, a prophet hero called Amphiaraus. His shrine is the Amphiareion, and the place is called Oropos. Now, we are visiting both some of the 5-star, must-see touristic destinations on our wanderings, but also a few very off-the-beaten-track places. And the Amphiareion at Oropos is one of those out-of-the-way places. Many guidebooks leave it out altogether. But it was a destination, in fact, so important to the Athenians that although it technically lay outside their territory of Attica, on the borders of the great cattle country of Boeotia, commanded principally by the great city of Thebes, famous for Oedipus, who had once been its king, the Amphiareion was claimed by the Athenians in the way that, since sanctuaries were so valuable for their political clout as well as for their religious prestige, kings and city-states throughout ancient history fought to control such shrines. Amphiaraus himself was a prophet. He was connected to that city of Thebes because he was one of the group of heroes called the 7 Against Thebes, about whom a number of the ancient Greek tragic playwrights wrote dramas. In the generation after Oedipus, that wretched hero who, although solving the riddle of the Sphinx, could not see that he had, because of not knowing his own identity, killed his father on meeting him at a crossroads, married his mother, the queen, when he came to Thebes, not knowing he was their son and the heir to the throne. Oedipus, on discovering his mistake, blinded himself at the end of Sophocles' famous play, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus Tyrannos, Oedipus the King, and went wandering with his 2 daughters through the Greek countryside as a beggar. But he left some sons, and one of the sons wanted to come back and rule in their father's place. This son was one of these 7 Against Thebes. Their mission was unsuccessful. They did not succeed in recapturing the city. And on the way home, the one of the 7 who had been a prophet, and you can never have a Greek military expedition without taking a prophet along to read the signs so that you are showing the gods that in a very pious way, you and your fellow warriors are counting on them to show you the right thing to do. The 7 included a prophet named Amphiaraus. And as he was leaving the scene of the battle in his chariot, the gods, to show their favor to him, decided to spare him a mortal death. They had the land open up near the border between Boeotia and Attica, swallow him up, and out of that tomb came his spirit, springing up above the waters that bubbled from the earth at that place. It was regarded as holy then, right down to the end of the pagan period, before the Christians and the Christian Roman emperors finally shut all of the pagan shrines. And it was a place first of going for oracles, and then as the idea of making pilgrimages to seek healing for actual bodily ills came to the fore. It became one of the many places where people who were sick went for healing in the ancient world. The Amphioraion is one of the loveliest spots in all of mainland Greece. It's a little cleft in the hillside, covered with trees, filled with shrubs of wild thyme, which make the air smell wonderfully fresh. And on a little sort of plateau of land near the stream that has cut that gorge, although it is dried up in the summer, are the buildings of the Amphioraion, the shrine of the hero, the prophet hero, Amphiaraus. There's a little temple there, or the remains of one. There's a beautiful little theater, which you can walk through and see some of the loveliest sculpted chairs for priests, carved out of marble, that you will see in any of the Greek theaters. Because, of course, this is, like most Greek temples and sanctuaries, a full-service sanctuary. You can be entertained with these sacred dramas to Dionysus, even as you are there to consult the oracle, or in order to have your ills healed by the power of the god or the hero who is the dominant figure in that shrine. Now, at the Amphioraion, the cult was an extraordinary one to our way of thinking. If you came with an offering for the god. And here at the shrine of Amphiaraus, it was supposed to be a goat. At the altar outside the temple, you would take your place in the line, the queue of people moving toward the front where the priests were with their knives. Your goat would be sacrificed, its throat slit, its blood poured out. Then it would be skinned, and you would be handed the skin. And that evening, you would go to a long stoa or portico and take your place there, wrapped in the skin of that goat that had been your sacrificial offering earlier in the day. The Amphioraion is a place of dreams. There are a number of such oracles in the Greek world where you would pass the night in the sacred precinct, expecting the gods to visit you and grant you a vision of the answer to your question, if it were oracular, or the explanation of what you should do to be healed if your problem was that you were sick. Why is there one of these water clocks on a slope near the edge of the Amphioraion at Oropos? My own theory is that since this was an oracle of dreams, the priests wanted to calculate an exact hour at the dead of night where they could count on all of their visitors wrapped up in those goat skins to be truly in a deep dream state. A float of cork or wood carried on it a little contraption including a bronze finger. As that water poured, so the finger went down a graduated scale of lines that showed the passing hours. And when the little bronze finger reached the point on the side of the set of lines that were carved in the stone of the water clock, they would go over. And as we know from another description of one of these dream oracles, they would in turn wake each sleeper and say, "What is your dream?" The dream was recounted. We have extraordinary records in some of the old Greek documents of some of these dreams. And then it would be written down on a tablet and left beside that sleeping person in the same way that a modern doctor on his or her rounds around the hospital might write something on a chart. Morning comes. The pilgrim wakes up, the priest approaches and describes for them something they probably don't remember, the dream and the being awakened in the night, and from that dream either give them the oracle that they sought or prescribe the healing procedure that the god has given the clue for in that dream. From Oropos, let's go south. Oropos is way up in the north of Attica. Let's go down the east coast, facing out to the Gulf of Evia, which separates the great island of Evia, or as the ancients called it, Euboea, from the mainland of Attica. Here we find several sites dedicated to goddesses. That means we're not going to know very much about the cults that went on there, because the women in Greek society had a deeper spiritual and religious life than the men. And most Greeks believed that it was the women of each community who, through their secret rituals, kept the state strong and healthy. It was a crime, in many cases, as so often with religious matters, punishable by death, for a man to try to find out what these women's rituals were like. As we go down the coast, we first come to Rhamnus, the place of the buckthorn, a little shrub, where there was a set of temples to two great goddesses. Nemesis, the goddess of vengeance. This is her only temple in the world that we know of. And Themis, the goddess of justice. Their temples are gone, but it's one of the most beautiful sacred spots in the Greek world, and although only a few stones remain of those classical sacred structures, I hope you'll go there and drink in that sacred feeling that came up out of the earth at this place with its incredible views over the sea, and maybe imbibe a little bit of that mystical feeling that seems to have convinced the Greeks themselves that just such a spot is sacred. As we go on down, we come to another shrine, this time of a much more famous goddess. The goddess is Artemis. The place is a little spot called Brauron, Brauron. This is a place where girls came from Athens in order to be initiated as girls into mysteries of this virgin goddess, this goddess of beasts and of the hunt. Artemis was served by these little girls who were called bears, or little bear cubs, in something like our own Girl Scout, Boy Scout, Cub Scout rituals in the United States of America. The girls apparently wore costumes like little bears. They danced. They made offerings to Artemis as the bear goddess, and somehow imbibed part of her power, part of her great independence, part of her divine majesty through this service to the goddess. Another wonderful place, and here you will see some of the colonnades of Doric columns still standing to remind you of how much the Athenian state invested in what was for them as important part of the operations of their government as any part of the democratic assembly or the political system in Athens itself. Further down, we come to the mining district of Athens. Lavrion, or Laurion, place of silver. Go to the little town called Thorikos, where the ore that came up out of the mines was crushed and the silver was extracted, which made those beautiful Athenian silver coins with Athena on one side and her special pet, her divinatory bird, the owl, on the other side. These coins were nicknamed owls, in fact, for the image of the bird. They came from the silver in those mines. Athens was blessed to be the only Greek mainland city that had large supplies of metal ores in its own territory, the territory of Attica. And it was here in the town of Thorikos and the adjoining hills of Laurion where the mining was done and where the remains of those mines are still there. Be careful, but if you can restrain yourself from leaning too far over, you can go into this region and see down shafts that go hundreds of feet into the rock, the limestone, the marble, and imagine the slaves down there working through the days as with hammers and crushing of stone, they brought up the ore that made Athens one of the wealthiest of Greek cities. Down at the southern tip of Attica, we are now in the region of the south wind Notos, N-O-T-O-S. We arrive at the most spectacular of the Athenian shrines, that of the god Poseidon. He's got a place for his niece Athena there also. We are at Cape Sunio, or Sunion, at the southern tip of the region of Attica. The great travel writer Pausanias, back in the time of the Roman Empire, when he wrote the world's first guidebook, A Guide to Greece, what was the very first site he began with? He imagined you, the traveler, on a ship, and he imagined the approach from the south to Attica and the great colonnades of the temples high on these 200-foot cliffs welcoming you to the land of Greece. The temples are still there, and it is one of the great joys on an evening in summer to get yourself out to Sunio, to stand by the columns of the Temple of Poseidon up at the top of the site and watch the sun go down over the Saronic Gulf, the body of water that is separating Attica from the great landmass of the Peloponnese. Some of the magic really still inheres at this place of Poseidon as it does at some of these other country, remote sanctuaries dedicated to some of the other gods beside the cult worship in the center of the city for Athena herself. As we go up now the west coast of Attica, we come to a cluster of sites on the west that will complete our around the compass trip. The first of these is Piraeus, or as the ancient Greeks called it themselves, the Piraeus. This was the port of Athens, 4 miles from the Acropolis and the center city, and connected during the glory days of classical Athens by long walls that reached all the way in a corridor, a protected corridor between the walls, from Piraeus to Athens, forming an umbilical cord that guaranteed that Athens could never be laid siege to and starved out, because as long as the long walls were protected, as long as the ships could enter and leave the Piraeus, Athens had a lifeline to the sea. I recommend spending a full day in this wonderful site. But we are moving on. We are moving on to, for a moment, a Byzantine site, a place called the Monastery of Daphne, which lies out also on the west side of Athens. This is a monument to the fervor and the building genius and the artistic gifts of the Byzantine Christians who made Athens one of their centers. At the Monastery of Daphne, artists were hired to create some of the most fantastic mosaics ever made in the history of Byzantine art. I was there recently when the place was filled with scaffolding, and they were very kindly allowing tourists to climb up the scaffold so you could get within arm's reach, so that you seem to be seeing in pictorial form the complete Bible laid out for you on the walls of this fantastic monastery of Daphne. But our goal in this around Attica place is a sanctuary to a very different divinity, the goddess Demeter, the mother goddess of classical Greek religion, who had her special shrine not just for Athenians, but for everyone in the ancient world at a little place called Eleusis. I'm going to take one moment here and talk to you about the fact that you're going to see names spelled in different ways throughout your travels in Greece, not just because there's Greek alphabet versus the English, the Latin alphabet that we are familiar to use in the United States, but also there are discrepancies about how to pronounce names. Elefsis or Elefsina is what the Greeks will call this place, turning the upsilon, our letter U, into an F sound. It looks like Eleusis when it is written in the English, and that's what I'll say today. Eleusis is a spot that is the terminus of a sacred road that began way back at the Dipylon Gate in the Potter's Quarter of classical Athens. And after a 9-mile walk, people from Athens coming out to celebrate each fall in the month we would call September would walk that distance to participate in initiation ceremonies into mysteries. The word mystē in Greek means initiate, someone who sees into secret things. And that was the appeal of Eleusis for perhaps 2,000 years, that it was a site where you could go and see into the mysteries of life and death. Surrounded by modern urban sprawl, Eleusis makes a very limited impression on a first-time visitor. But pass into the site through the ticket gates, and you will see before you the shattered remains of a monumental Roman gateway. In fact, most of the remains that you are going to see are from the Roman period, as the classical and earlier material has been masked or destroyed by what came afterwards. Pay special attention off to your right to a rocky overhang in which there's a little shadowy cleft. It's going to play a big role in the myth of Eleusis. Ahead of you, around that little rocky knoll, lies a vast space, once a covered building, where you can actually sit on bleachers, stone seats carved into the native rock. And beyond that again lies the indispensable Site Museum of Eleusis, where you will see some of the treasures of the site and many artifacts and art images that relate to the mysteries that went on here, all mysteries relating to an essential ancient myth. We've talked about Greek temples, as we've seen places like the little temple at Amphiaraos, where you come with your goat as a sacrifice, the priests take over the goat, sacrifice it for you. In many temples, including the holy temples to Athena up on the Acropolis, that was what you were involved in. It was like an insurance policy. At regular intervals, you would come with an offering, an animal, honey cakes, money, incense from Arabia, and you would leave that as a gift as you would put down an insurance payment, confident that then in times of stress or disaster, the gods would be looking out for you. That would be your payoff for all of that steady down payment of these sacrifices. That's a pretty chilly relationship between a god and a human. Eleusis, off in the western corner of Attica, shows us a very different kind of relationship between worshipers and the god, a relationship that prefigures those of our modern world. At Eleusis, according to the myth, there had been a king back in the Bronze Age, the heroic age, the time of the Trojan War, the beginnings of things for the Greeks. This king welcomed to his land, there at Eleusis, the great goddess Demeter, who came weeping and was found by the king's daughters at the spring where the girls would go and draw water. They questioned the woman. She ultimately revealed her identity and explained she, the goddess of grain, one of the great nature goddesses, was weeping because her daughter, Persephone, had disappeared. Through a cleft in the rock that you can still see today, it was claimed that the god of the underworld, Pluto, had looked up one day and seen Demeter's daughter Persephone at Eleusis picking spring flowers. And he rose up through that cleft, seized her, and dragged her down to the underworld. Demeter punished the earth, cast a curse upon the earth. No crops should survive. And Zeus, who was running out of offerings to keep him alive, because the gods depended on all those animals and plants offered by their human worshipers for their existence, Zeus had to give in. The result was a compromise. When they found out that Persephone had eaten something in the underworld, they said, since you have eaten something there in a strange, magical way, you must spend part of your time in that spot. She'd eaten some seeds of a pomegranate. And because she'd eaten part of that fruit, she had to spend part of the year in the underworld with Hades or Pluto, that who was actually her uncle, that god who rules below and is the Lord of the dead. And the rest of the time she could be up on the surface of the earth, bringing growth, life, flowers, bloom to our earthly world. That is what Eleusis commemorated. Every year in the autumn, when the rains were beginning, people from all over the Greek and later all over the Roman world would gather there, and they would come to this sanctuary on the west edge of Attica and find themselves surrounded by a high wall from the Pisistratids, those tyrants of Athens in the 6th century BC who did so much to make the city monumental, a high wall protecting the sanctuary from the outside world. They would enter on a multiple-day experience, including processions, including purifications in which you waded into the sea and made sacrifices there, but ultimately leading to a moment where you entered a hall that stood on the spot where there had once been a Mycenaean palace, the palace of that king who, according to myth, had welcomed Demeter to his halls and had given her hospitality while she mourned for her stolen daughter. In the final thrilling drama of your time at Eleusis, you would enter that hall called the Telesterion, a great big square or rectangular place with stone seats coming up on all sides, the roof held up by columns. You're in a functional cave here. It's dark inside because things are going to be revealed that will change your life. Just as at a modern Christian revival meeting, without any sort of use of drugs or anything else, people are so caught up in the moment, so caught up in the belief, they feel their lives change, they feel themselves reborn. That's what happened to you sitting there in that shadowy telesterion in Eleusis, just a few yards away from the cleft in the earth where the underworld god had come up and seized the spirit of life and spring in the form of Persephone. You're going to get the power to defy that. You are going to get the power of life over death. In short, you are going to be given a blessing by the goddess Demeter with the knowledge that when your earthly body dies, your soul and spirit will live on. And the cults of Mithras, in the time of the Roman Empire, that god from Persia who granted the same power to his worshipers, and indeed the power of the Christian faith to draw so many people to it, depended on that same promise, life after death. This is the first place in Europe where that promise was made to people. And the urge to receive that promise drew thousands to Eleusis every year until the Christian Roman emperors shut it down. Now, our question is, what you're waiting to hear, what happened? Things were revealed. What did they show? I've already told you the problem. This was a women's cult. It was dedicated to a female goddess to reveal the details of what you had seen when you were initiated, incurred the pain of death upon you. Men and women alike went to Eleusis, sat next to each other on those stone seats which you can go and sit on yourself today. And they saw something so impressive, so life-changing for each of them, that not one in the centuries that the shrine was in operation ever broke that vow. So we don't know exactly what happened at Eleusis. We only know that people found in it something that relates much more to our idea in the modern world of the religious experience, a true emotional union with the deity, and a promise of something that would be in the world to come to act as a beacon for you in all your actions for the rest of your life. We know that people enjoyed that experience so much, found it so meaningful, that initiates went back year after year to accompany the initiation of new members into this cult of the great goddess Demeter at Eleusis. The last time I was there, I took the Homeric hymn to Demeter, written down probably about 600 BC by a follower of Homer, in which the myth that I told you has been recounted in poetry. I sat with a group of students, we passed the book around, and each read a passage until we had finished the whole telling of the story. And then one of the students looked over to that cleft and noticed that something had been left there as a modern offering. A tourist before us, a modern pilgrim, had come prepared with their own pomegranate. It had been slit open, a few of the seeds scooped out, and the remainder left as an offering to that ancient ideal on the edge of that very ancient cleft. Whatever you choose to bring, I hope you will find at Eleusis some of that same mystical sense of connection with the universe, of a vision of life triumphing over death that so many people in the ancient world have found there before you.